So a couple days ago, Xparu published this piece, Fantasy Visualization and Analysis, Stage 1. I helped out quite a bit with the analytics of this after the initial kind of visualization strategy that Xparu brought to the Winston's Lab Discord. What it really promises to do is something quite dramatic for analysis of statistics in Overwatch, potentially for visualization, and I recognize that. The reason that what he did was so potentially useful and just something that needed to be thought of was that if you consider the data set, even though we have more statistics in this in Overwatch than just the ones included in Fantasy, even within Fantasy, 5 variables is very difficult to comprehend and visualize the space effectively. So to give an idea of why that might be the case, 5 variables to plot accurately all of the data that we have at our disposals with 5 variables requires a 5-dimensional plane. Now, 5 dimensions. Now, obviously, we can't really do that. I mean, you can sometimes use other things than location as a proxy for some extra dimensions, but those things tend to not come across very well to visually, unless they're very specific types of variables. Like color would obviously be a perfect if the last variable actually was color, then that would be fantastic. But otherwise, it becomes quite difficult to display things. Even in 3 dimensions, very few people are able to really get a good handle on 3-dimensional plots and what they actually represent. So what he promised was that although there are 5 dimensions that we're dealing with, that there are such strong correlations between the individual patterns of those individual statistics that it really could be compressed into a plane, into a 2-dimensional grid with relatively low loss of information. The basic insight of this is that if you have 2 pretty distinct categories of even just 2 of the given 5 statistics, which is kills, first deaths, and ultimates. If you have 4 out of the 5, or even just 2 out of the 5 in many cases, you can pretty well guess what the others are. So if you're someone that dies a lot, you probably die first a lot, although there's some variance there. If you get kills, you probably get more first kills, although there is variance to that. If you have high kills and low deaths, that probably means you have a very good ultimate count. And if you die a lot, that probably means you have a bad ultimate count. And then there's other, and the trends differ quite widely by, in this case, role, which is the offense players, tank players, and support players within Fantasy, although this analysis could definitely and potentially perform better on specific heroes, where play styles are you're more confined within the limits of a champion. So there's less variance in what is possible based on specific heroes. So I'll go down ahead. There were some problems that it appeared that some people were having. Now, I think that a lot of that comes down to unfamiliarity rather than anything inherently difficult about the task of using these graphs. In fact, I think that it's easier than people think. So I think that if you just try to replace that, that feeling you have when you look at an equation in algebra and just like a blank stare and then just your brain turns off. Just try to intuitively determine what you think the right answer is. And we think that this graph is set up so that you will be probably right in the intuition of what that means. So I'll give some examples. and see if you can follow along. So wait. So I'll stick with the graph as you would see it if you're just going on the website here and you don't make it larger. So what are we seeing here? So I would ignore the X and Y axis, other than the fact that it appears like there is more variance on standardized PC1, as it says, and you can see that because it says it has 75.7% explained variance versus 9.8%. So it is a more dominant thing. And not too surprisingly, offense heroes, a big differential for them and how many points they get, it appears to be how many kills they get. Now, unfortunately, it is a little off of the graph here, mostly just because of how ridiculously long this arrow is. We could have potentially expanded the x-axis out to the left, but the downside of that would be that everything else would get smaller, of course, in relation to it, just to fit. So there's trade-offs there, but since you can see all four other ones, and it's pretty obvious that among the components that first kill points would probably be pointing in the same direction of kills. And even if you didn't make that intuitive leap, all four others are accounted for. So we know what this is. And we say it down below. So that should be reasonably clear. So let's just take a random point. Let's take a random player and I'll give a second to try to figure out what the intuition behind this should be. So let's take, for instance, let's take undead. So in relation to the arrows, so there's two things you can do. One intuition is you can see how far away players are from each other. So we can see that Pine, Shadowburn, Fleta, Wicked, Linkser, Seagull on the top side there, Prophet down here, Carpe, Birdring, all of these names that we know have performed super well in the offense category are down here. Undead is way up here. There is not a name near Undead that we have historically in Overwatch League seen as being a high performer. That distance indicates that Undead has not performed well, at least for fantasy purposes. Now, how much of that is his fault versus his team? Well, that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about how were his performances and his statistics through stage 1, which were not apparently favorable. So let's see why are the players on the graph where they are. So for Undead, which arrows are pointing towards him? Well, first deaths and death points. So I'm assuming your intuition would say that if you get death points, you move towards Undead, right? And you'll notice that he's far to the right of everyone else on the x-axis in this case, which is kill points and first kill points. So what that indicates is that although he doesn't have necessarily the lowest, he does have quite a low amount of kills relating to the time that he's played. And ultimates. He's all the way up here. Ultimates points down. He's not getting many ultimates either. There's really nothing positive with this top right quadrant, in fact. And not surprisingly, you'll see D and Undead, who have been on the struggling Shanghai Dragons, Clockwork and Spree, who haven't had terrific performance, Tavik, who hasn't had a fantastic performance so far, at least in fantasy terms. Could definitely argue. So then let's take a more positive side, and hopefully I'll give you a second to try to make some intuition, and then I will say what I'm gonna say, and then you can compare notes. So let's look at Striker. What can we say about Striker? So I'm giving you a bit of time. So what pops out to me is that he is super low on the principal component access 2. So in fact, he's the lowest player, and definitely the lowest when you consider how much play time he has, which is the size of this circle, which is explained below. Size and shape, liability estimate, smaller circles, da 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 da. So he has a lot of play time. He apparently, some combination of getting very, very few deaths relative to other tracers even, which you'll notice that there's a lot of tracers on this side of the axis anyway who have low deaths and high ults, partially due to how quick ults charge for tracer. But he has very low deaths, very high ults, or some combination. And he does appear to be slightly higher kill rates, although there's not any evidence here that he has a higher first kill rate, although maybe slightly, than a lot of other tracers other than maybe Birdring, Carpe, and Prophet. But they give up something because, well, they're not as far down, which means they might die a little bit more, or maybe they don't get quite as few ults to make up for it. So looking at this, I would say that Striker is a player that does a lot of damage to build up a lot of ult charge, and he also stays alive a lot, which allows him to be doing a lot of damage to gain a lot of ult charge. So these clusters are not too important for fundamentally understanding what every individual point does. However, the number of clusters was decided by us after looking week by week and picking out the overall patterns of how many of these clusters really are consistently different. So you'll notice that there's some variability within the cluster. We have found that a lot of that variance really is noise, and that the cluster does actually perform a little bit better than taking the individual average of the player, for instance, in the past, and just assuming that's what they're going to do in the future. That really it is useful to categorize what other players perform similarly to a given player. So, for instance, Birdring, I wouldn't look at Birdring and assume that he's going to get in the middle of this. I wouldn't be surprised if on a given week he was anywhere within this circle, for the most part. Somewhere in this general vicinity, he could bounce around quite a bit. This is definitely not Birdring's true self. It's just a point estimate of where he has been in the stage on the performances we had access to. Okay. So then the second graph here is the exact same plot. The only difference is instead of showing the players' names, we showed the hero that they play the most of. This is just to be helpful because we are showing it by role within fantasy instead of by name. Since we're doing that, some of the variability on the plot is not actually due to performance, and some of it really is, it appears quite role specific. So you'll notice that there's a lot of tracers on this general vicinity. It seems to be home. And that really what that does is it even allows us to notice how outstanding a player from fantasy perspective that Prophet really is here in that bottom left. He's the only tracer player who's been able to be captured by this bubble up here, and which appears to be the highest performing cluster, at least for offense players, and is miles away, performing way more kills, while still maintaining the fact that he doesn't die just like other tracers, and he gets lots of ults like other tracers, and yet he's able to get a lot more last hits, which is valuable in Overwatch, even if it isn't holistic of the offensive capability of a tracer or any other player. So then let's move on to another one, and I'll probably just jump down to, I'll start going quicker through these and just kind of picking out the things that I'm looking at, dealing with a couple of these different ones. So once again, we have one of these, mostly because it's a super long arrow. If we want to see it, then we have to expand the graph and make everything smaller, which might be a reasonable trade-off. Please let me know if you think that is a good trade-off, to make everything else smaller. There were some concerns about overlap of names. That is inevitable, unfortunately, because some people are quite close to each other on the graph. The only thing that we could do potentially would be to basically have it so, like, I don't know, like you have the point and then you have their name off to the side, but then if too many of those names start, it becomes very difficult to know whose name actually goes to which. Like on this graph, for instance, Fraggy and Coco's name are right on top of each other, which is unfortunate. And maybe it's just me, the fact that I know these, I can fill in a lot of the gaps just mentally because I'm so familiar with a lot of the players in the league, that I'm able to tell this. Keep in mind, there's a general visualization tool to pick up the overall trends. If one name on the plot just doesn't come out very well, that's unfortunate. And perhaps we can give a tabled version of this at some point, where we give every player's name and the corresponding cluster they're in and their current and their value on these values, so you can find them if you're curious about individual players. But the purpose of this is to pick up overall patterns, not to be a full-out reference tool for every player's information. So, and just letting you know that if you want, you can make your life easy. This thing actually has quite a bit of resolution to it, and it becomes a little easier to tell that that is Fraggy and that is Coco. But looking at this, so the first thing that pops at me is that ult points is incredibly important. Now this is absolutely not surprising, because Diva ult is not counted, is not picked up currently within the reader right now. It's not being picked up in statistics. So if you are a Diva player, bad luck to you. You're not going to get very much of the statistic. So you'll notice that basically all of the Winstons are on the left, Winston mains and main tank roles, and all the Diva mains are on the right. So what we're left with is really one primary axis to work with. So we'll notice that if the farther right you go, that you have more kill points in general, and that the farther left you go, and up specifically, the higher deaths that you have. So once again, you can kind of notice that there are some general patterns, which you can pick up just by association. So when we think of who are the best players who are Winston players, well, names that come to mind: Gesture, Gamsu, Fate. Maybe someone would have had a Muma. Maybe someone would have had some others. But those three probably would be pretty high on the list. So you'll say, whoa, okay, well, that makes sense. They're all in one cluster. They're actually quite similar in their performance. And so why is that the case? Well, you'll notice that they are on the kind of on the right side on the death pretend spectrum. And keep in mind, this death pretend spectrum also points up, so they're actually farther down. So that's good. And then also you'll notice that first kills, that they are farther to the right than everyone else, and they are and those things also point down, and they're farther down. So that is basically saying, is in both metrics, and what this basically says for tank players is that if you get, it's in fact the exact opposite of the common perception of if you try to get really aggressive and get a lot of kills and you're going to die more. What this actually shows is that, and even for first kills, that actually players that die a lot do not actually get more kills. Now, some of this might be a function of being on better teams, but for fantasy, we don't care the reasons. What we care about is whether it's predictive of the future and building a good roster that's going to get us points. Okay. So you'll see that some of our worst performing Winstons, people that we don't think of as being all-stars so far in this league on the roll, Swoosh, Fraggy, Coco, Rashawn, I remix on kind of the lower but somewhat close to the average performance. And then on the Diva side of things, you'll see that a lot of there's kind of a too many clusters here, but they're closer together in terms of fantasy performance. It appears that the level of Diva that you have doesn't come through as clearly within fantasy as it does for Winston, it seems, for instance. The clusters are much closer. And you'll notice a Cool Matt note and Envy, Mickey are on the bottom. You'll notice that some of the worst performing tracers in terms of fantasy are all together. So you can have two sets of intuitions. You can look at the directions of the arrows, and you can also look at people that you know perform well, and then proximity to those players in various roles. Okay, and once again, Winston's on the left. Diva's all on the right. And then lastly, support. The main thing that pops out on this is that, so over here on the left, we see a lot of Mercy players. And on the right, we see a lot of players that have been playing a lot of Zenyatta. And the thing that pops out is that these three players have been all-stars this season in terms of at least fantasy performance. Shonak leading the pack, but Bedosin and Nico not too far behind. Jaehong near the top of his particular cluster. And overall, you have kind of mediocrity in the middle. There seems to not be too much that can be picked up about differences of Mercies. Like, for instance, Arc, we know, has been a fantastic Mercy. Toby, not so much. And at the same time, that isn't necessarily showing up very well in this particular graph. So perhaps Mercy's skill isn't quite as good of a proxy, and it's a bit more of a homogeneous and random distribution of differences, it seems, on the Mercy side, at least for fantasy purposes. Ultimate points, by the way, since Mercy's calculation for the fantasy points includes resurrections, that was kind of thrown in ultimate points because adding a sixth line to all the graphs, especially when it doesn't apply to all the heroes, seemed unnecessary. And yes, okay. So I think that should help. This section underneath this first one does go through every component one by one. And if you have any questions with the descriptions of any of these components, you can definitely feel free to ask. I'm actually going to review the Reddit comments that we got and provide some feedback to those commenters on maybe what they should do a little better if they're trying to provide constructive feedback. So I appreciate the sentiment of this top comment, which apparently struck a chord with a lot of people visiting the thread. Although we still maintain a decent upvote ratio, there clearly are a lot of people that through either discomfort with things that don't immediately jump out at them and make obvious intuitive sense. I think that in some ways people have an don't adjust their expectations of how easy something's going to be based on the difficulty of the task being brought to you. So if we were just going to provide win rate by some random statistics, then it would be incredibly easy to do something that you would even see in like an Excel graph to show, hey, look, there's a trend. Unfortunately, what we were doing was trying to visualize a 5-dimensional space, which is impossible, by collapsing it into a plane. And giving a reasonable, giving you all the tools that you would need to reasonably intuit it, where there's really no excuse for coming to the wrong answer. There may be, I suppose, if you just completely look at it and you just get deer in headlights, this is complicated, then that doesn't help you. But if you make a good faith effort to try to evaluate and take specific examples and try to piece it together, I don't think there's a way you can intuit this plot incorrectly. So I did address his problem of the fact that things are overlapping, which is that we could have made our lives a lot easier if we had just made instead of having names, we just put dots. Because that would have accomplished a similar goal of showing the distribution of differences. But unfortunately, that would have given lost a lot of information, because for the one hand, although you're making it visually easier to see, you lose the ability to see players that you know are good, players that you know are underperforming. It gives you a separate data set in your mind to help evaluate the meaning of the plot, which is valuable. And also it obviously eliminates the ability to get value by looking for a particular player you have a question about and seeing where they fall in stage 1. And it's saying that you can't read half of your graphic. That proportion is quite off. So I think that the ggplot's a pretty good software package. I think that overall it's a pretty clean graph. I think that the only major issues that I'm aware of is that the lines are potentially, we could look into scaling the lines differently to make it so that they always fit on the plot. That usually only happens for extremely long ones. It only happens to one of the vectors. But I disagree. I'm sorry for giving you a headache. And I think it is intuitive. So I think this represents what some people feel. I think that you just have to, just like the basic algebra problem, you have to try to take it piece by piece. And I think that it's much more intuitive than algebra, for instance, where I don't think that you would actually come to the wrong conclusions ever. So in my response to saying that anything that would remove the complexity would start throwing away a lot of information, says that it makes sense to me because I made it. So I agree that both because of the fact that I do data analysis for a living and my hobby, along with Overwatch as viewing and analysis, that I agree that I am more comfortable with it than a vast majority of people out there likely. I disagree, though, that it is only intuitive because I am familiar with it. I have tested it on several people who were not involved in the creation process, and giving any good faith effort, I haven't had anybody who wasn't able to figure out how to use it. And then thank you. This is not our target audience since we're going for fantasy, but it is a great example of principal component analysis because the amount of correlation between these variables is actually quite high, even though they are not causal in nature, which a lot of times you won't find in many data sets. Okay, well, let me know in the comments if you have any questions.